Hey everyone, got a fun little surprise for you today. We've got a break from our regularly scheduled programming. We're going to be airing an episode that I did with Vitalik and Chris Goes of Anoma, which was the final interview of the intense discussion day at EthCC this year, which was phenomenal. Huge shout out to Anoma for putting that on. We're going to be airing a couple of different EthCC related episodes to give you guys more of an on the ground view into what was going on at the conference. We still have one more episode for you on the restaking season. Miles and I are going to be airing that next week. I promise that's going to be great. But for this episode, I hope you guys enjoy. Chris and Vitalik are two of the most visionary protocol designers in the entire space. And this was a really fun end game discussion around intense protocol design and a whole bunch of other interesting stuff. So again, thank you very much, Anoma, for putting this entire thing together, and hope you all enjoy. Hey everyone, this episode is brought to you by Namada, the shielded asset hub rewarding you to protect the multi-chain. So not only can you protect your own data across any asset and any chain, but you also get shielding rewards for strengthening data privacy protections for everyone. So you can check them out at namada.net and follow their mainnet launch. Stick around, you're going to be hearing all about them later in the program. Hey everyone, this episode is brought to you by Kinto, the safety first L2, which is accelerating the transition to the on-chain financial system. They've got some very cool features like user-owned KYC and native account abstraction, which solves a bunch of the onboarding and bottleneck problems that many L2s suffer from. So you're going to be hearing all about them later in the program. But if you want to learn more and better, if you want to join their launch program, Engen, E-N-G-E-N, you can click the link at the bottom of this episode. Go check them out. Tell them I sent you.
All right, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. Before we jump in, quick disclaimer. The views expressed by my co-host today are their personal views, and they do not represent the views of any organization with which the co-hosts are associated with. Nothing in the episode is construed or relied upon as financial, technical, tax, legal, or other advice. You know the deal. Now, let's jump into the episode.
Really excited about the last Campside chat. The topic is protocols, ecosystems, community, and tokens. Actually, the first time these concepts were discussed in public outside of the work we do at our team was at the Bell Curve podcast that was hosted by Mike Polizzo from Blockworks. And I find it really exciting because after that podcast, this concept actually stuck. I heard that Mike actually did use the same concepts with the same definition in other episodes. Well, so yes, please, Mike, thank you for joining us today, and take it from there.
Awesome, thank you. I appreciate the kind words there, and that shout out to the Bell Curve podcast. I learned everything I know on this topic really from the team at Anoma, so huge credit. We've got a lot to cover today, and I actually want to use this discussion as an opportunity to widen the aperture a little bit and zoom out and discuss how this new paradigm of intents is changing the way that we think about blockchains and protocols and communities. But maybe we could just start with a super quick round of intros from our speakers here. Vitalik, on the off chance that there is one person in this room who doesn't know who you are, could I pick on you to go first here and give yourself a quick introduction? Then Chris, if we could go over to you.
Sorry, I didn't hear the question well.
Oh, I just, I'm not sure. Sorry, can you hear me now?
It was to introduce ourselves, right?
Yeah, I think
yes,
if you could make yourself like 20 decibels louder, I'd appreciate it.
I'll try to yell.
Okay, so the question is to introduce ourselves. So okay, so I don't know. I mean, I have a blog, vitalik.eth.limo. I have a GitHub. So if you discover that the blog sucks, you can go to GitHub Buterin blog, and then you can actually put PRs to the blog and help make the blog suck less. So people have done that occasionally with typos. That encourage more people to do it. I mean, if you want to make a PR that just deletes the whole blog because you think it's that negative to society, you could do that too. You'll have to do some convincing to get me to accept it. I don't know. Otherwise, I dabble in this Ethereum thing. Yeah.
Yep. I'm Christopher. I also have a blog, actually, but it's harder. It's very hard to spell, which I realized was like a shitty marketing decision. And occasionally I end up in a position in Germany where I live where I have to explain to some person in the bureaucracy how to spell the word plurinimity, and every time I just curse my life. The blog is plurinimity.org. I also have a GitHub, and I am an Ethereum crowd sale contributor, but I lost my private keys.
Can we also
Wow.
make PRs to your GitHub to delete your blog?
You should make a PR to my GitHub that like adds my private keys back so I can claim my 2,000 ETH that I bought with Bitcoin, then moved cross country and seed phrase bye-bye.
Yeah, so Vitalik, let's see what we can do about that. Maybe we'll take that offline now. All right, guys, I want to, like I said, use this as an opportunity to zoom out here a little bit. We are now 15 years into this crypto experiment with the creation of Bitcoin. We're about 10 years into the Ethereum experiment. And Anoma we're a little bit newer, but it's a very promising start. And, you know, over the years, Vitalik, that blog of yours that you mentioned has gotten a lot of eyeballs and it sparked a lot of discussions within the community. And I would love you to maybe put your protocol designer hat on here. I know Ethereum at this point is extremely decentralized, but if you could just give us sort of a history of your thought process when you were first creating Ethereum. What were some of the core design philosophies that you thought of back then? And maybe with the benefit of hindsight, what are the things that you got right and developed largely in the way that you thought they might? And then what were some big surprises to you, or things that might have developed differently than you expected, or if you had the benefit of hindsight, what would you maybe do differently?
Yeah, so the way that Ethereum originally started, right, was that I was working for some of these other, like what were originally called Bitcoin 2.0 protocols back then, things like covered coins and Mastercoin. And I eventually had this idea that like the best way to increase your functionality is to add in a general purpose programming language. And at that point, I just realized that like at that point, you might as well just replace their entire protocol with a general purpose programming language. And I suggested this to them, and they were like, it'll take a while before we get to it in our roadmap. And then I realized that like they didn't get it, and I started doing it myself. So then I think this idea of a general purpose programming language was like the very initial core, like the thing that made Ethereum be what it is, as opposed to being something else. I mean, but at the same time, there are obviously a lot of other peripheral design decisions that were made too, right? Decisions around, for example, the currency supply that was originally linear growth, around having an ASIC-resistant proof-of-work algorithm, around having the ability for like miners to vote on the gas limit instead of it being a fixed number. A whole bunch of things that were basically saying like don't make the mistakes that Bitcoin made. That was like actually a big like generator of ideas near the very beginning. One of the other things that I wrote at the beginning was, of course, the white paper, right? And the white paper, in addition to like having protocol details, it also listed some use cases, right? So the very first one was issuing tokens, but then there was stable value assets, financial derivatives, decentralized file storage markets. That was a fun one that was in there. Parametric insurance, and then like the list, DAOs, and a couple of other things. And I feel like most of that list got tried, at least in some form or other. I think, probably the decentralized storage market stuff is like probably the one that kind of disappoints me the most. But who knows? Maybe it's still possible. The one big surprise, NFTs were a big surprise. I totally did not expect NFTs at all. In terms of like more pure technical stuff, I think. There were a bunch of errors like the 256-bit VM and like various other smaller decisions. I think doing catch-check was probably a mistake. There's like smaller things. One of the bigger overarching ones, I think, was like basically not like underestimating development time. Like I think if we had a clear picture of development time, we probably would have like kicked out the like 4 out of 5 less important things in the roadmap and like focused much harder on getting a much simpler proof of stake done and getting a much simpler scalability solution done. Like that's definitely something that we've learned from over time, right? Like like we've done a much better job of like focusing on what's actually important since then.
Yeah, Chris, maybe I'll kick the same question over to you. And I know you were integral to the development of IBC, so I'd like you to talk about that in a little bit. But you also, and I apologize because I called on you in this bell curve episode to talk about this as well, but yeah, it seemed there was a lesson that you took away from the founder of Signal, who gave a talk, Moxie Marlinspike, about the pros and one of the drawbacks of designing decentralized protocols. So I'd love if you could actually just reiterate that again to the audience, and then maybe how that informed your entire philosophy of protocol design.
Right. I'm very happy to do this. So the talk in question is a talk by Moxie Marlinspike. I believe it was given at 33C3. You can find it online, and it's called The Ecosystem is Moving. And basically the talk was a defense of why he chose not to federate Signal. And the reason he gave for why he chose not to federate Signal, or at the time he was kind of running the Signal development organization, why they chose not to federate Signal, was that they wouldn't be able to iterate on the protocol as fast. And he viewed Signal as competing with basically centralized messaging services, with WhatsApp, with services provided by Apple, provided by Google, provided by these like Web2 companies headquartered in California. And none of those services shared Signal's values of privacy or user sovereignty or anything like this. They were just going to ship features as fast as possible to get as many people as possible to use their chat apps. And in his view, and I think that this is frankly just been borne out by recent history, the critical disadvantage of federating your protocol is that now the social consensus to change it becomes much more complex. So now in order to get a bunch of, in order to Matrix is maybe an example of a protocol that actually tried to do this. In order to make changes in the protocol, you can't just change the protocol on your one server. You have to talk to all of these people. You have to convince them of something. There's politics. And in his view, that federation he wasn't denying the benefits of federation to some kind of operational decentralization, but in his view the most important variable for Signal to optimize for was an ability to ship features quickly enough that they could compete with the centralized protocols and still provide the privacy that he viewed as essential to their mission and values, as I understand it. So that was kind of his reasoning, and I think that often that philosophy can be really usefully applied to decisions we make in the blockchain space. In particular, once you make a decision to launch a protocol or to put something out in the world, to have it transact with real money, to kind of decentralize the operator set, decentralize the governance, everything becomes slower. It becomes an order of magnitude slower. And I think there are many reasons that we want to do this. I wouldn't want to give up on this dream. But I think we also kind of need to balance it with a need to iterate on the protocols quickly enough that we can build something that's actually competitive with Web2 or with banks or with what have you, considered holistically from the perspective of the user.
And so I guess what that begs the question of is how do we as designers and contributors to decentralized protocols ultimately successfully compete against our centralized counterparts, right? Where they have the advantage of sort of efficiency and speed. I would love to get a sense just over the years, what is the trade-off that we're all comfortable accepting here, and how can decentralization be a superpower? And I think that's going to bleed into the discussion around community here. But talk to me about your guys' perspectives. Okay, we know that we can't just unilaterally make decisions like we could if we were operating in more of a company setting, but what are we getting on the other side of that ledger? What's the benefit there?
Yeah, I actually think it's easy to overrate the extent, to be overly pessimistic about the ability to actually upgrade these protocols together, right? Ethereum has done it, right? We execute upgrades of the execution and consensus layer across an increasing number of client teams, and are getting a more and more efficient pipeline for actually doing this. I think and I actually think the the force functioning aspect of consensus there helps quite a bit, right? Basically, that if a hard fork is decided on, then if you're at some the date is fixed, and at some point if you're lagging, then you're just not part of the chain anymore. So I think these are really things that can be improved on quite a bit, and I think I actually think that we've done quite a good job, and certainly a much better job than a lot of people were expecting at the beginning. In terms of the benefits that we get, I think, it is case specific. I think if you zero in on, Ethereum's multi-client architecture, for example, right? The original reason for this is basically the political benefit of avoiding centralization within one development team, right? And that itself is one of those kind of learning from Bitcoin's failures kind of situation, right? With how basically the way that I interpreted it, and I think I would say still consider kind of, the Bitcoin Core team's stranglehold over the protocol at the time, like basically ended up, leading to a bunch of decisions on, things like the block size and so forth. If you have multiple teams, then there's like more realistic choice, and like the ability to sort of, fire one of the dev teams actually becomes a more realistic thing. So that's one thing that I think is valuable. Another thing that I did not appreciate at the beginning is that I think having 5 parallel teams like actually gives you a larger pool of expertise that ends up being helpful in like a whole bunch of ways that are difficult to like even anticipate, right? Like basically, the pool of people that just understands like layer 1 like code development issues, and that's able to push forward on proposing ideas like much more efficient archive database architectures is like 5x bigger, right? And like that's not even a benefit I was going for, right? That's like a benefit that I learned over time. So I think like that's also something that's proven to be really valuable for us.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would say to me, the great benefit of decentralization is diversity of sort of perspectives and diversity of ideas and opinions, and even diversity of organizational structures. Like, I think it's fantastic that Ethereum sort of informal governance has the ability to pull off something like the merge, which is still, as far as I can see, the most kind of complex distributed system upgrade ever executed in the history of humanity ever, which is a pretty good big achievement. But also, I think it's good that there are like perhaps more centralized or just earlier stage projects in the ecosystem that are doing other things and offering different perspectives. It's like with Anoma, for example, I view part of what we should do in order to be valuable to the ecosystem is be like different than Ethereum, right? Like the world has an Ethereum. We don't need another Ethereum. We need something not only different, but maybe even complementary in specific ways. Yeah. Like maybe, we view part of our role is trying to provide kind of a different angle to the research discourse that can eventually meld and become complementary and even be kind of synthesized, but that starts from a different position. In starting from a different position, it can articulate a different perspective, and then through synthesizing these, we can come to perhaps some common understanding that ultimately bridges the gap between like the theory of the layer 1 and the theory of the user. So that's sort of where we start from as far as concerns that question. I think the other challenge that I see here is not really, maybe this one is a bit less related to Moxie's talk, but the thing that makes it really difficult to change is not just decentralized collaboration. It's also like having a blockchain that carries financial assets. And when you have all of this, state that people deem to be valuable moving around, they really don't want anything to go wrong. And so you have to move very slowly. And you just have to move slowly. It's not like the people don't want the wrong thing, right? They're right. But on the other hand,
except for the one time when you move quickly, which is when you have DOS attacks and consensus failures.
True. But I think there's something to be said for like spending some time designing a protocol before you launch it. I think often the quest to make tokens liquid or something like this, and the view of those, the liquidity of those tokens for whatever reason being coupled to some kind of protocol leads projects like, I guess I felt this way with Cosmos, which I worked on before, leads projects to launch very quickly before they've kind of thought about all of the problems. And then once you've launched, as soon as you have operational decentralization and real sort of assets, real value flowing around, then it becomes very difficult to make decisions. And sort of now you're kind of, you see a sort of plateau in terms of the rate of change. So I think it would be interesting to investigate capital structures which didn't have this problem. It's not just one of operational decentralization.
Hey everyone, this episode is brought to you by Namada, the shielded asset hub protecting the future of the multi-chain. Namada is a chain that's near and dear to my heart because in previous seasons of Bell Curve, we've talked about how the cardinal original sin of most blockchains is not thinking about privacy from the beginning, but also because if we want to onboard a whole bunch of applications, it doesn't work in a default transparency setting. So Namada not only brings about a better future that we all want, but it's going to help onboard a ton of new applications. So Namada introduces a novel shielding reward system. The way that it works is if you hold your assets in the shielded set, you help strengthen Namada's data protection guarantees and collect rewards in return. Namada will initially support IBC and Ethereum-based assets, but eventually the idea is for this to expand into a comprehensive hub for all assets. Really, really excited about what the folks over at Namada are doing. I highly recommend that you go and check them out at namada.net. You can follow their mainnet launch, which is soon TM. Very exciting. Tell them that I sent you. Click the link, bottom of the show notes. Hey everyone, this episode is brought to you by Kinto, the safety-first L2 with user-owned KYC and native account abstraction that is accelerating the transition to the on-chain financial system. Now, we've been talking about Larry Fink on this program and how he's been shouting the good word about tokenization to all of his buddies on Wall Street. This is happening. And the very cool part about Kinto is that they are built to accept a whole bunch of assets and a whole bunch of users from the traditional financial system, which current L2s have done an okay job, but there's a lot of room for improvement for onboarding. So it features very nice things like user-owned KYC and native account abstraction that solve some of the biggest blockers around mainstream adoption, namely security and user experience. You can become a founding member at engine.kinto.xyz. If you believe in this on-chain financial system, join Kinto's launch program and thank me later. Cheers, guys. And the link, bottom of this episode. Click it now.
So I want to actually maybe take this as an opportunity as well to try to get a sense of, maybe Vitalik, I'll call on you here because you wrote a phenomenal blog post a couple of months ago after Blobs went live, saying that we've kind of moved from this being a 0 to 1 problem to a 1 to n problem. And I think this blog referred to a couple of previous blogs where you sort of show this growth scale where there was a lot of changes that were happening in a very short period of time, and now we've moved on to a more plateau phase for Ethereum's growth, where there's still some definitely big upgrades coming, like Vertical trees, etc. But a lot of the technical growth that needed to happen in a very short period of time has happened. Can you just expand a little bit on what you wrote in that blog post? And if we're done with a lot of the really hard, fast-moving technical parts of Ethereum's roadmap, what comes next?
Yeah, I mean, so like the merge was like crazy complex, right? And it was crazy complex from an implementation perspective, from a spec perspective, from the perspective of the ecosystem adapting to it, all kinds of perspectives, right? Like even an ideal upgrade to proof of stake, like take like the ideas of single slot finality and then plus some kind of pre-confirmations on top of that, like even a change like to that, right? The delta between like now and Utopia is considerably smaller than the delta between now and proof of work, right? And I mean, even like just the fact that like proof of stake has like fixed slot times and it has things like finality, like that alone gives us like many more possibilities to actually run that upgrade smoothly, right? Or even the fact that we actually have execution consensus separation, right? Like all of these different things like make any future upgrade much easier. For the surge, right? So the L2 centric roadmap, right? So the things that have been done already are, one is getting users in the ecosystem comfortable with L2s, right? And I mean, there definitely are big bumps in the road that we're talking about, but like we've already seen a lot of upgrades. Like even, for example, with some of the newer wallets, having to manually switch networks for an application is not a thing anymore, right? Like a larger number of applications are happening on L2s. I mean, I think the closest we have this cycle to like a legit application that's attracting mainstream interest, I mean, it might quite possibly be Polymarket, and that's, it's on Polygon, right? Big success of L2s right there. In Farcaster, on an L2, lots of things happening on L2s. From a technical perspective, right, the thing that 4844 did in particular is it created this blob structure, right, which basically meant that L2s have to do this one-time work of moving their data from being call data to being blob data. And if they did their job right, then like basically everything that we do from here, including peer DOS, including full data availability sampling, even including replacing the KZG with some kind of like a Stark-based structure, like even that can all be done in such a way that roll-ups, again, if they did their homework right, can just keep functioning without any changes whatsoever, right? And like that's powerful. So that's something. Basically, like the change, there is still work that needs to be done, but the work is kind of inherently more behind the scenes and inherently less disruptive than before, right? So I think the common thread across a lot of these, right, is that like the future work, there's still significant stuff remaining, but like as you go further and further down the roadmap, like the changes start becoming smaller, they start becoming like actually more incremental, they start becoming less disruptive, and like I think on an even faster curve, they start becoming less disruptive to applications, right? So there is this very real way, I think, in which we've like crossed a bunch of big chasms already. And, there are definitely still very significant chasms left to cross, but I think they're already, like smaller than the ones that we've already gone through.
So, one quote that stood out to me that you wrote was from your blog was emphasis is already slowly shifting and will continue to slowly shift from L1 problems such as POS and scaling to problems closer to the application layer. And later, you used even stronger language and said what this means to developers, given all the advancements that we've had so far in the scaling roadmap for Ethereum, is that we no longer have an excuse. Up until a couple of years ago, we were setting ourselves a low standard, building applications that were clearly not usable at scale. But today we have all the tools that we will need, and indeed most of the tools we'll ever have to build applications that are simultaneously cypherpunk and user-friendly, which was just a really strong quote and deeply resonated with me. What do you view the duty, if anything, that Ethereum, the L1 has in terms of creating like a better user experience for users, especially now that many users are on sort of L2s? Right? Is this kind of up to L2s and applications at this point, and we just need to light the metaphorical fire under their butts, or are there additional things that Ethereum L1 can do?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's like in some ways the key question that's being discussed, right? I think there's like a certain kind of set of kind of things that like seem pretty well understood, right? Like basically, the idea that L1 is this like common settlement layer. It's the thing that kind of assets ultimately end up moving in between. It's a thing that allows L2s to be able to do things like reading each other's state and so on and so forth. And then there's definitely like stuff that's around the edges, right? So like one of the ideas around the edges is like basically if one service that end user applications need is fast confirmation times, right? And then the question is like one possible extreme of a roadmap is basically if we like explicitly say that L1 is not for users or almost entirely not for users. L1 is for L2s, and it's L2's responsibility to provide fast confirmations for users. And then if we do that, then like the optimum strategy for L1 would be, for example, to like do a single slot finality with, like for example, like potentially even set conservative parameters to make things lighter, like 32 seconds slot time, I think would be perfectly fine, right? And then L2s would be responsible for doing like things on a much faster basis, and then you would even have like things like ERC7683 for like faster cross L2 operations, and so on and so forth. And L1 would basically just have to focus on being as censorship resistant as possible, as 51% attack resistant as possible, as simple as possible, and that's it, right? The other roadmap is to say, like basically, can we to some extent make L1 somewhat more expansive? And the benefit of making L1 more expansive is that there's like further guarantees that are guaranteed to users at the L1 level, and that means that L2s have to do less work. It might also even mean that some portion of applications are able to just continue living on L1. Basically, you're essentially trading off like some amount of L1 complexity, but then you get like potentially a very large gain in L2 simplicity, right? And so if like L1 can have like faster confirmations, for example, then like that greatly increases the set of L2s that could just be based rollups. And being a based rollup is just like incredibly simple, right? Like the amount of work that you have to do as an L2 goes down by like a factor of 2 if you're based. So that's I think like that's one of those big dimensions that's like still really open to a lot of discussion and open to still a lot of technical proposals, right? I think basically there's like the minimal L1 vision, which basically focuses on this like entirely on the settlement layer approach, and basically pushes L2s to provide all the functionalities, and then you can go kind of more maximalist in like particular specific directions.
What do you personally think the Ethereum L1 should do?
See, this, again...
So, okay, here's the thought experiment.
Okay.
Imagine that, like, you could make a sort of invisible dictator decision and change some parameters. You could even change the issuance rules. You could, like, fund EIP 7683 development or something like this. And then no one would know you had done it. We just reset history, and everyone thinks it was social consensus. So, you know, taking out the kind of long-term effects of someone making such a decision, what would you do?
Yeah, no, this is... I don't know, I'm trying to think, because... like, there's definitely things that, like, I would have done differently in the past, right? So, like, one of them is just, like, start with a much simpler version of proof of stake and, like, basically not do the whole Gasper thing, right? Basically do something that's, like, very, you know, kind of like chain-based proof of stake, and then upgrade to, like, what we're thinking of as being single swap finality now, like, at some point in the future. And that could have just, like, saved us years on that entire development stream. I think, okay, on like specific properties that I think are valuable for the L1, I think, I mean, okay, there's a couple that I think are super valuable kind of regardless of the direction, right? So one of them, I think, is that like Ethereum still is the like from what I can tell the only L1 ecosystem, and like this, like not even Bitcoin does this, that like really tries to take the concept of recovery from 51% attack seriously, right? Like basically, everyone else either waves their hands and says it will never happen because incentives, or you know, basically, they say like, oh, social consensus will fix it, right? And like both of those answers kind of worry me, right? Because you know, I definitely don't think that you can just rely on incentives, because, you know, we've seen that like extra protocol incentives can just like appear very quickly, right? And then the problem with saying social consensus will fix everything is like, that feels good to say while we're in this like happy, fluffy kumbaya ecosystem where you know, like everyone
meets at conferences and goes to panels together.
Yeah, and like everyone you know, like vaguely agrees on like, you know, like cyber libertarian ideals of like how we should think about censorship, and
not sure that I'm agreeing with that, but yeah.
And you know, like and so on and so forth, right? But then imagine like 10 years in the future, you know, you have like you know, like BlackRock in the ecosystem. You have like major $1 trillion funds. You have like huge corporate stakeholders. Then you know, are we really going to be that certain that like if a 51% censorship attack happens, the other 49% of the companies are like actually going to like coordinate and revert the chain out of you know, their loyalty to Ethereum values, right? It's like no. And so I think the best shot that we have is to make 51% attack recovery something that's as automated as possible. And there are like actual consensus theory or like research directions that can like really improve on this, right? I mean, obviously there's mathematical results that basically say that like 100% utopia is impossible, right? But you know, the like 90% may be possible, right? Like even you know, there are designs by which you know, you could do things like, if your validator, you know, sees that like other particular transactions are being censored, then it could like refuse to build on the censored chain, or it could refuse to build on chains that are trying to censor you, right? And like basically, there's a lot of like design opportunity to try to build architectures where if a 51% attack happens, it basically automatically, just by people running default software, fails in the direction of the attacker having one chain, and then basically all of the honest good guys being able to coordinate on a single minority chain, right? And if you have something like that, then like basically, you know, the kind of social consensus game theory around like actually coordinating around recovering from that 51% attack and like actually burning the money of everyone who participated, like suddenly becomes much more viable, right? And so, like, this is why, like, I continue to not be a fan of, like, I think there definitely is a kind of like economic consensus and like slashing defeatist mentality that's popular in some other L1 communities that basically say things like, oh, we cannot protect against all the failures because like at the very least censorship is not a fully attributable fault, and so therefore we have to rely on social consensus, and so therefore we should just lean on social consensus fully, right? And like I'm not comfortable leaning on that, right? And I think there is value in like Ethereum being the chain that stubbornly specializes in refusing to rely on that, right? And in like like actually being like actually having a very, very clear and like both like maximally programmatic where possible, but also like kind of very culturally ingrained where culture is necessary strategy for like actually being able to recover from 51% attacks. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is, of course, like really caring about censorship resistance, right? So like one challenge, for example, of this minimum L1 roadmap is like, let's say we have 32-second finality on L1, and let's say in 32-second slots on L1, and then L2s are responsible for providing fast confirmations, right? One big downside of that world is that if one of the L2s decides to censor you, then like they can basically suddenly degrade your experience by a factor of like 1,000, right? Like if L2s provide 32 millisecond latency, which servers totally can, then like if one of them decides to censor you, your latency goes all the way up to 32 seconds, right? And like for some applications that feels fine. It's like, okay, fine, let's say, I'm, like donating to, like controversial political charities. Who cares if the money gets over in 32 seconds or 32 milliseconds? But if you think of like financial applications where we're talking about like DeFi liquidations in the context of like rapidly moving market conditions, or even let's talk about like doing games on chain, right? It's like, okay, imagine you're like, we put World of Warcraft on chain, and like you really care about.
That's the real goal of Ethereum.
Exactly.
Put World of Warcraft on chain.
Yeah, and like imagine like you really care about whether or not your latency is like 150 milliseconds or 330 milliseconds, and then at some point it's like, oh, you're playing. You're playing on like that, that version of hard mode where if your character dies, you go all the way back to layer 1, and then you get into like a PvP fight with someone, and then the person you're PvP fighting against, they manage to like hack into the server, and the server starts censoring you, and then they censor all of your spells for 32 seconds, and within 32 seconds, the other guy kills you, and then your character is gone, and you lost months of work, right? So basically. 32, like censoring someone for 32 seconds is like very non-trivial in some applications, right? And so like that actually is one of the arguments in favor of like a more maximalist vision, specifically in the case of like, let's say, the L1 providing, let's say like confirmations on a 2 to 4 second level instead of just finality on a 32 second level, right? So but regardless of like which one you choose, right? Like I think it's it's good that inclusion lists are being highly valued, and I think it's good that like even some of these like parallel multi-proposer ideas that might even obviate the need for inclusion lists if something like that gets adopted are being considered, right? So, like. I think basically, regardless of whether we take the kind of minimalist L1 path or like a somewhat moderate L1 path, I think like actually taking this like very sophisticated approach and asking like, what does it really mean to have a maximally robust base layer, and like actually trying to do that, like I would love to see us like actually doing more of that.
So I think another question that I have as well is I would love to transition into talking a little bit about, as we're moving to a more modular world and we're beginning to unbundle some of the functions of blockchains, what does the role of standards have there as well? And do the two of you see any limitations to, say, just pure unbridled free market competition? Where there's an analogy in the real world where there's something called the tragedy of commons, where you can't just toss everything up to the free market because, fishers will literally fish an entire reserve until it's down to nothing and things of this nature. We have something called the government that will step in and try to moderate some of that. And I would be curious, as we increase the complexity and move computing to different environments, what is the role of standards, if any, play here? Maybe Chris, I could toss it over to you first.
Yeah, first I would want to draw a distinction when we use the word modular. I think often modularity in protocols is conflated with like modularity in networks. And if you draw boxes that kind of stack things on top of each other, one interpretation of those boxes can be layers of a protocol, which build sort of abstractions one on top of the other and hide implementation details, which makes sense when you design protocols. But another interpretation of those boxes can be nodes sitting in between you and like the L1 in the network. And often the actual modularity that has happened is more the latter thing. It's like less about, in practice it has been less about designing very clear abstract interfaces in your protocols and more about, putting a lot of intermediaries in the network. And I think the reasons for this latter thing have more to do with capital structure than any like particularly well-grounded design philosophy. To me, the important part in modularity in protocol design is critical, and it needs to separate out kind of the right things. Like you want a clear understanding of what the different kinds of entities can be, what kind of roles different kinds of entities can play in your protocol, what roles are really like fundamentally distinct, what roles are fundamentally coupled, and how do you want to reason about who is performing those roles and how who is performing them is changing over time. So, for example, in kind of a roll-up-based roadmap, as I understand it, or sort of a modular blockchain frame, the L1 chain is providing both at least temporary data storage, data availability, and ordering. And in some kind of more plasma-like scaling roadmap, the L1 chain is only providing ordering. So there's a different set of like roles that are coupled. In this plasma roadmap, they're like maximally, I don't think you can, decoupling ordering more, you need ordering to happen in one logical place. So decoupling ordering more, I think the only direction I see there is something like inclusion lists. So one thing I like about that kind of frame is that it illuminates like what kinds of decoupling are possible, because what kinds of decoupling are possible is sort of a property of, like it's a property of mathematics, a property of protocols, whereas what kinds of coupling actually make sense just relates to sort of economics and incentives. And I think as protocol designers, you actually can't choose which kinds of coupling make sense. You can try to restrict by building protocols that support only one thing or another thing, that protocols that only support certain roles being coupled together, but then the incentives in actual practice will kind of play against that, and you end up with sort of hacky intermediate solutions, stuff like this. So I think an analytic approach that tries to maximally decouple things is really helpful, even if the actual operation ends up being coupled in practice. Just to touch quickly upon the second question that you asked about sort of protocols and market structures. I think there's a lot of both value and danger in the choice of metaphors. And often we think of, protocols, at least in this ecosystem, as some kind of free market competition. And I think the free market competition is good for the protocols. Like, it's good for the ideas, because the ideas can be freely copied and remixed and recombined. They can easily evolve. No one is, the ideas are the permissionless part, right? So I think it's very good in terms of building a kind of collaborative research discourse and just making progress, although a lot of terminological confusion tends to come in if marketing gets too involved. But I think the disadvantage of a very kind of decentralized protocol development ecosystem is that the guarantees provided to the user tend to be fragmented, difficult to understand, and too complex. If you look at like the most successful consumer software companies, mostly they're like large hierarchical organizations like Apple or Google or Microsoft or something like this. And I personally hate living in a world where most software that people use is made and controlled by those organizations. But I think the reason that we do live in that world is partially just the fact that those organizations can coordinate what software they're building. They can coordinate the interfaces. They're internally not markets. They're like patronage structures or something like this. And that coordination allows them to deliver an ultimate product that's sort of more aligned with the needs and the interfaces that the user wants and expects. So I think maybe one way to investigate how we could improve crypto's ability to deliver this is to investigate kind of alternative capital structures that would meld in between this kind of free market, which certainly has some benefits, and a kind of single hierarchical organization, which has some different benefits and drawbacks. If we can somehow split the middle there, I think it could be really interesting.
Yeah, and I think to me the big thing that's really important to preserve as we enter this like L2 world is to make sure that it's like the greater Ethereum verse still feels like Ethereum, right? And like the reason why, well, like I intentionally want to use this kind of like more abstract framing instead of like specific statements that have like mathematical meanings like synchronous composability is that I think most of the time synchronous composability is not what people want, right? Like people generally, I think, don't care as much, if their like thing finishes within one transaction or within two transactions a second apart from each other. Like the biggest pain point is like, oh my God, what does it mean when I go to a different dApp? I have to like suddenly switch networks, and what does it mean that like I have to like figure out how to like deposit to Polygon? What is deposit to Polygon? I'm using Ethereum here, right? And like the biggest composability unlocks that like matter, I think, is like the 80-20 of composability is basically like you should be able to take an address and put your address into the receive field of your browser of your browser wallet, and then click send, and then that should click send to the recipient is, and that recipient address should include whatever chain the like L1 or L2 or whatever the recipient wants to receive their coins on, right? So like basically, like I mean that's just ERC 3770, right? And like basically, like actually having that integrated as a default thing across wallets, and also getting to the point where like fast cross L2 transfers, which realistically requires liquidity forwarding, are kind of like this ecosystem-wide public service that exists without dependency on specific intermediary actors, right? So, like those are just examples, right? Like I think if we walk through the list, we can talk about how like it should be possible to change the owner of a safe account without doing it in 100 places, and then that gets into like key store wallet discussions, and then there's like various other instances of that, right? But like that's where I see the greatest value of standards. And then in terms of like incentive structures, I do think that there need to exist some kind of entities that actually do a good job of actually building that stuff. And I think the properties that those entities need to have are basically that they need to have kind of like incentives that are either sufficiently aligned with the whole ecosystem, or where they are like basically a part of the ecosystem stack that's just on a completely different axis, right? Where it's like basically like it's a commoditized to complement strategy for them essentially, right? And we've seen like for example Uniswap like already do a lot of work in like ERC 7683 for example, right? I mean I don't think we should lean on Uniswap. I think there's definitely more that the Ethereum Foundation can do. There's probably as I've suggested before, room for making an equivalent of the protocol guild that's like cross L2 infrastructure guild, and then keep going from there.
What would you think of something like changing the ETH issuance rules so that you can issue some ETH to rollups that feel like Ethereum and not to rollups that don't?
That's a fun one. I mean, I think this is actually one of the reasons why I'm like really grateful that Zcash exists, right? Because I think, so the general reason to be scared of that sort of stuff is like basically the possibility that it gets captured, right? Mm-hmm. And like Zcash managed to do that with off-chain governance, right? And like Zcash is more centralized in terms of its community than like I would like, although I know that with things like Shielded Labs, they're like trying to actually make an effort to improve on that, which I think is super cool. Like basically, like I think it's definitely nice that there is experimentation with those kinds of ideas. I mean, I think the big thing to solve for in that case is like basically like how to make that stuff not be a political shit show, right? And like I think the best technology that we have for not creating political shit shows is often indirection, right? Basically, it's like instead of choosing who gets the money, you choose the mechanism that decides who gets the money, or even you choose the mechanism that decides the mechanism that decides who gets the money. And like the more indirection you add, the more you like actually put people, behind the veil of ignorance, right?
So like poly market for Ethereum public goods funded by L1 emissions?
Right, like retro funding. I mean, well, it's, well, let L2s figure that out. I mean, I think, if Ethereum governance like 5 years from now ends up, like deciding to like do things like that with like 25% of, the like 1559 burn, like interesting, right? I mean, I think. This
not out of the Overton window. It's within the Overton window.
Let's Okay, let's say it's like within the Underton window. Okay.
Okay.
I don't know. I mean, like, come on, like you guys, like you know, like I mean, like, can like we please have like other people debate this?
Right. Fair. I mean,
Yes.
it's my job. Conceptual terrorism, right?
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's like such a fun phrase. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, you can be Ethereum's official conceptual theory.
All right, I've got a maybe a final closing line of thought, and again, I got to give credit to the Chris and Anoma's team here for giving me the words to describe this. But I think one of the ways that we talk about unbundling different parts of what a blockchain does is we tend to talk about it through the lens of data availability and execution and settlement and actual things that blockchains do. But in another higher sense, I think you're actually unbundling what it means to what are the different core components of a blockchain, which is an asset, a security model, and a community. And one of the things that I think the roll-up scaling roadmap has accelerated is this unbundling of kind of like Ethereum or whatever blockchain blockchain user exists as a community versus the asset. And the mental model I think that a lot of people have about how blockchains can compete is, hey, I'm essentially this generalized computing environment, and you can build a bunch of apps here, and maybe those apps generate money, and that somehow accrues value to my token. But for me, the stark data point that contrasts this is actually Bitcoin, where the token has continued to do well and compete in this market of monies for a long time, despite growth on the technical side being relatively stagnant. Although that is definitely changing. And I would love, maybe Chris, it was originally your blog post that inspired this idea, but if you could describe this process of unbundling of different core components of a blockchain, and then what are the different vectors that like a community can compete on versus a protocol versus an asset to compete on, and how separate are all of these things going to be going into the future?
Right. I mean, that's a very broad question, but just to kind of summarize the direction of change as I see it, we all started here because of Bitcoin. And Bitcoin bundled together everything into Satoshi was many things, but he was not the most elegant coder. And Bitcoin was an asset, a protocol, a community. It was all of those things like rolled up into one. And at the time, I mean, I don't know, I guess I participated in Bitcoin Talk in 2011 or something, 2011, 2012. But at that time, which is the only one I know, people really viewed these things as like essentially coupled. Like they didn't, sometimes there were people experimenting with colored coins or starting to experiment with Ethereum, but they viewed like the asset and the protocol and the community as a very coupled thing, right? You would always have assets associated with protocols. And over time, we've seen these things start to decouple. There's an Ethereum community, which at least I see as related to, but meaningfully distinct than ETH, the asset, right? You don't have to, no one when you go to conferences asks you, do you have 32 ETH? That would be the like solo staker test. If you don't have 32 ETH, you can't attend this conference, right?
You're unaligned.
Right. There's maybe a softer definition. There are values. There are kind of things that the community wants to see, wants to build, things that they want to do for users.
It's like if one person runs Linux, but they have no ETH, and then the other person does everything on an iPhone, but they have 1,000 ETH. Who's more aligned?
Right. The alignment test, right? So there's some social thing going on that is, it's definitely not specified in the yellow paper.
Let's do somewhere between neutral good and chaotic good.
Right. And I think that to me the value of the Ethereum like comes from the community, and comes from, even if you want to look just at the asset. If you are you are a US dollar maxi, and many of us appear to be closet US dollar maxis, at least by revealed preference. If you are a US dollar maxi, the thing you care about in the context of Ethereum is just how many US dollars can I trade it for, right? It's a very boring life. I don't recommend it, but that's what you care about. And if you care about that, then the thing you care about is just like, who will trade me US dollars for Ethereum? Like, that's the only thing you care about. How many of those people are there? What is the supply demand? You don't care about how many people are paying ETH for gas on the L1, except insofar as it like forms some of the demand, but most of the demand is not coming from that. Most of the demand is coming from people who just want to like buy into the community, who want to support the project, who think that the project will do well, but ultimately that goes down to some reason that they think that there's something valuable in the ideas and in the community, much more so than just gas being paid on the protocol.
I agree. Hey, gotta compensate for the 5-minute monologue somehow.
So just to this is kind of throwing an idea into the mix, but to touch upon if we understand these things as separate, an advantage of doing so is that it opens up many very different capital structure options. Like one reason that assets are so competitive with each other is that they are viewed typically as alternatives, that you sell A to get B or you sell B to get A. But there's nothing inherent to the identity of assets that forces them to be alternatives. For example, if asset A issues 50% of its supply every year to holders of asset B or to asset B governance or something, and asset B issues 50% of its supply to asset A, these are really they're almost not distinct assets anymore. They're kind of partially melded. And if you take this number up to 100, they become literally the same thing. So there's this kind of sliding scale we could use in coupling assets together that I think might allow for more just collaboration and more deduplication of actual work within the ecosystem. But we then need to open the capital structure exploratory window to allow for some of these things. And some of them, to touch upon your point earlier, are tricky because they are difficult to do in a way that's sort of objectively neutral. That if you have some governance function deciding what an asset gets issued for, or what other assets an asset gets issued to, that there's no way to decide that via some abstract mechanism. You could put prediction markets there. You could put something. You could put more things in between. But ultimately, there are some people, and they need to make some arbitrary decisions about what they think will be valuable in the world. So I think there's kind of some conceptual tension to square here.
Yeah.
I've got a final closing question for you, and I can't see the timer because of my virtual appearance here. But so I'll just. Okay, excellent, thank you. I would love to get a sense from the two of you, and Chris, this is something I've asked you in the past, but Vitalik, I'm curious to get your opinion as well. Is let's say we're having this conversation 15 or 20 years in the future, and we're looking back at the crypto experiment, and we're deciding what made it successful or not successful. What would make you look back and say, this has been an extremely worthwhile use of all of our times, and I'm very proud of this, versus what would make you say, this might have been disappointing, and how can we avoid the disappointing outcome?
I think ultimately, the final determinant of this is going to be what the technology gets used for, right? If we actually do get, either to the point of mainstream or to the point of kind of being a Linux level credible alternative to the mainstream, something for example, Ethereum based accounts as a replacement for, signing in with social accounts. Or just cryptocurrency as a financial system, or DAOs as an alternative to either corporations or nonprofits, or one of any one of applications in the various different spaces, whether decentralized social media or prediction markets or whatever. If at least some of those take off and it becomes clear that it's had at least the same level of impact on the world that Linux has, then to me that's a success. If on the other hand, basically the space gets remembered as a bunch of a dwindling group of idealists screaming in the group as a slightly more slowly a dwindling group of people trade digital monkeys and celebrity pictures with each other, then I would say that's not an honorable result for the space, right? And so I think my thesis for continuing to work on this stuff in 2024 is that I think it's even more high leverage than just kind of the average value of the space, because I think basically the way that I see it is the monkeys and the celebrity photos are going to be traded regardless of whether fees are 2 cents or $20, and regardless of whether finality happens in 2 milliseconds or 20 hours. But a lot of the more use cases that we actually care about, that's really does depend on having a reasonably competitive level of things like fees and user experience, right? And so the more we can actually get to that level, the more that like that stuff actually happens, right? And I think we even see some examples of this being true, right? So I think, going back to kind of the two, application use cases that kind of maximize, for me, the dot product of like being successful and being what I personally find interesting, I would say, like Polymarket and like decentralized social media, right? And I think what's interesting about the main contenders in both of those spaces is just how much better the UX is today versus the version of both of those that existed 5 or 10 years ago, right? Like, okay, so who here has like traded on Polymarket in the last year? Who here remembers trading on Augur 5 years ago? Trading on Augur 5 years ago was like not a good experience, right?
I agree.
Yeah. I mean, I remember, then eventually there was Catnip, which made it slightly better, but even on Catnip, I paid over $1,000 of transaction fees, and like even still, there was like a whole bunch of UI hell, right? And with a decentralized social media, we basically had the exact same thing. Like, who here remembers trying Status in 2019? Also hell, right? Like,
yeah. But impressive ambition.
Indeed,
they're still
but
at it.
they, basically, I think they got the memo. They went into a cave, and like they've actually come out of the cave. Like, have you tried their latest demos?
No.
It's like actually good. So it's basically like the UX level has like actually gotten to the point where like it's moved away from like being this like geek toy where you basically have to be a decentralization religious fundamentalist to put yourself through the experience to something that like normal people actually wants to use and participate in, right? And like that's been a huge gain that's happened over the last 5 years alone. And that gain has proven itself in the like actually much more successful level of adoption of both of those use cases, right? So basically like I want like that, but like 5 times more and in 5 times as many spaces.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would second that. I mean, I think I would answer in sort of, just to build on that, 2 parts here. One is, to me, the kind of promise and the limit of what the technology can really offer to communities is the ability to intricately balance between, or to have both, in many cases, of autonomy and interoperability. So in most of the systems in the world today, communities, both like at all levels, at the level of the individual, at the level of the family, at the level of the group, the city, the society, even the country, often face choices between autonomy and interoperability. If you want to interoperate with the US financial system, you have to use SWIFT. If you want to interoperate with, the financial, as a country, you have to use SWIFT, or as a bank. As an individual, you have to use a bank. Even if you just want to, I don't know, like give promises to other people that are denominated in dollars or something like this, you don't have the ability to do that. You have to trade off your autonomy for interoperability with the system. And I think crypto can provide kind of standardized protocols that allow communities to very cleanly delineate the kind of parts that they want to be dependent on others for and the parts that they want to run inside themselves autonomously. And if the protocols facilitate easy interoperability, then the switching costs are low. So then when you want to change the topology, you want to change who's part of your community, you want to change who you're dependent on, you can do that easily. The second part of the answer I would give is social. I think in 15 years, I would like to be completely irrelevant. Blockchain technology should be boring. It should be like a database conference. Like, who here would go to a database conference? Nobody. 1 person. Okay. Someone will still be here for you, but it won't be me if we succeed.
Right. Time's up. Thanks a lot, Vitalik, Christopher, and Mike. We have time for 1 question. Of course, Nathan.
I have a question, yeah. Vitalik, you made a really interesting comment on the existential danger of social consensus. And since it's existential, is there a role for accelerations of fear? I know at one point, people in the Ethereum community were like, we're going to do a real climb. Everyone else was like, stop.
Oh, interesting. So you want to like start the EAC movement of 51% attacks?
Well, I'm thinking that maybe if you encourage people to sort of move fast and break things and challenge the progress, or that you're like force functioning dealing with this, or still have time to deal with it.
Right.
You have a BlackRock and all these other actors in there. It's like just too. And that might be
Yeah.
Can you first repeat the question?
Yeah, no, the question is basically like, is there value in like taking an accelerationist approach to like some of the economic problems in the space so that we basically kind of like run through all the failure modes and have a chance to fix them before the space becomes even bigger and we're even more incapable of coordinating? I mean, it's definitely an interesting argument, right? And I think like there's definitely ways in which that's kind of ended up already panning out almost accidentally in some ways, right? It's like imagine the world if like the Mt. Gox collapse had never happened, right? That plausibly could have been a world where like people would just have thought, nobody would have thought that DEX technology is important, right? And, where people would be like 10 times more comfortable just using centralized exchanges for everything. And then it's possible that like FTX might have been worse by, enough that the total amount of money lost could have been greater, right? So, I mean, it's the sort of thing where like, it's like we're talking about like a very like response to threats is a very chaotic system, and it's like it's very easy for arguments like that to be correct, but then it's like also very easy for like bad people to narrativize themselves into thinking that they're good by using these kinds of arguments even when they're not true. And so I think my personal preference is like I want that stuff to happen, but ideally at smaller than Ethereum scale, right? Like I think, what we want, like I think the missing middle for a lot of this is like we need something that has an economic scale that's like somewhere in the, let's say the geometric mean between like a testnet and a mainnet, right? Like this is what I advocate for, like for example, the whole kind of like base pre-confirmations direction, right? Basically, that like, or execution tickets rather, right? Basically because like from a technical perspective, like within the mathematical model, it seems fine. But then there's like all of these centralization risks and multi-block MEV risks and like all these risks that are just like inherently very hard to model. And like you're not going to learn anything about them on a testnet, right? But if you were to try them on an L2, where the TVL of the L2 and the level of DeFi activity is like somewhere in the tens to hundreds of millions of dollars instead of like Ethereum scale, then we would actually learn something, right? This is probably the one unclaimed niche for an L2, right? Like basically the explicit kind of like the crazy it's like the SEZ of crypto anarchy, right? Basically just like the thing where you're just like encouraged to go crazy, and like there's a social contract where we basically beg as many regulators as possible to just like make us all the stuff legal. And if you want to play there, you can. Otherwise, you just just like stay in the regular world. Like where you actually get like some level of this kind of economic data and like hopefully get like actual answers before they can go like to Ethereum scale. Like that would be better, right? I mean, I think applying that to Ethereum, it's like using Ethereum itself as a sandbox. I feel like the stakes are like getting to the point of being a bit too high already, but like layer twos, they feel at about the right level of scale.
Hey everyone, hope you all enjoyed today's episode. Want to give a final shout out to Namada, again, a team that is near and dear to my heart. They are building the Shielded Asset Hub, which is protecting the future multi-chain. Talked a little bit about how that works in the mid-roll, but for now, what I would highly recommend that you do is go check them out. They're in their mainnet launch phase. You can follow along with everything at namada.net. You can start rewarding yourself by shielding your actions and strengthening data privacy for all across the multi-chain. So thanks again, Namada, for all the great work that you're doing.